Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Welcome one and all to the Defiant Takes Football Show. I'm Max Dean, the Max Dean on Twitter, here with Nick Merriam at Nick with Sports. Oh boy, all right. Some schedule fluctuations, you know. We ride the wave, we live in the moment, but we are here to talk about the prospects in the 2023 draft who catch the football. Yes, we're talking wide receivers. And Nick, being our director of draft content and scouting, of course, we're going to rely on his rankings and tiers here. Nick, how you doing today?
Doing pretty good. My family is away for the weekend for a kind of impromptu like field hockey thing, so I'm watching the dog, and throws a little wrench in my planning for scheduling things, but we're doing it. Good.
Well, look, I think your dog would be the dog situation would not be a situation if I didn't stay up all night editing prospect breakdowns, and actually was where I was supposed to be. So, you know, but I wasn't expecting you to say impromptu field hockey. That come out of left field. But yes, we have a number of draft prospect breakdowns on the YouTube channel. You can find them as we speak. We've got 5 up right now, primarily quarterbacks, the top guys, plus Jalen Carter from Georgia. And then we have a couple of wide receivers coming your way very shortly. We also have offensive line specific breakdowns called brick wall breakdowns that I do with Kyron Samuels, who's our offensive line expert. So you can find a couple of those up too. But so aside from these live shows that we're doing where we're actually ranking and tiering everybody, you can get some individualized content as well. And there's lots more on the way. But today we're going to look at all of the wideouts. The top however many that you've decided to put into your tiering system here, which is fairly elaborate, might I add. But look, before we get into it, do you have anything that you want to say about the wide receiver class as a whole? Any trends that you've noticed?
I think it's kind of, we've had this trend with wide receiver classes where we either determine like right off the bat if it's good or bad based on if there's like a bunch of players in the top 15 prospects, and then there always ends up being like a good number from the 20th pick onward, and this is the same thing again. I don't know if any of these guys are going to rise up the board to where they're being taken in mass where they were last year. Where I think last year's class we were like, this isn't that great of a class, and then as time went on we were like, oh, it's pretty good. Like 4 guys get taken in the top 15 and 5 guys or whatever happened. That's not going to happen. But there's definitely a number of players here that are going to be contributing year one, especially from day 2 selections.
Okay, so just giving a quick heads up for what your tiers are. Your tier 1 are starting wideouts with versatility. Tier 2 are just starting wideouts. So I guess perhaps role specific. Tier 3, slot receivers only, or mostly. Then we've mostly. Tier 4, developmental receivers. And Tier 5, wide receiver 4s with special teams ability. And then Tier 5, that's what you just said. Yeah. Tier 5, wide receiver 4s. So do you have anything specific about those tiers that you want to comment on?
Yeah, there could be more players that are added into each of these tiers. The wide receiver 4 tier is extensive. It's going to have like a lot more players than the guy we're going to talk about. But since we kind of limited this video to a top 10, we kind of just have like the first player in that tier, which we'll talk about in a sec. Developmental also is going to be a little smaller, but there could be some other players in there. But I'll explain like the detail of like why the players are placed into those tiers as we get into it.
All right, so let's jump right in then. Tier 1, starting wideouts with versatility.
Yep. So technically, starting wideouts is 1 tier, but these guys are a score higher than the guys in the next grouping, at least the way that it was taught to me. Positionally, these are guys that you feel like projecting to year 2 will play on the outside for you at some point. Now, both of the players in this tier for me are mostly slot players in college. Jackson Smith and Jigba, who's my wide receiver 1, is a guy who is like a slot player going into the league, but I think has such good tape and production in the slot that he could be a Cooper Cup type slot player where it doesn't really matter that he's playing in the slot. He is potentially your best weapon on your NFL squad, right? And then Zay Flowers is a guy who does play outside, and I think will translate to playing outside, but he's just kind of one of these guys where he will move back and forth, and you would not be getting the most out of him if you weren't doing that, right? So there's a little bit of a versatility difference between these guys and the other guys. And in all of these tiers that we've done throughout all these videos, they're all year 2 projections. So these guys might not initially be outside players for certain, but by year 2, week 1, we're expecting they will be, right? So in Smith and Jigba's case, we did a video on him. Weird prospect, different, right? Like high production, maybe not the athleticism you're used to seeing from a wide receiver, kind of a guy that really produced a lot out of the slot, not against press coverage. People are worried about that. But I think when you watch him and you really go into the details of how he plays, he's veteran. Like for a young guy, he plays extremely savvy as a slot receiver. He understands spacing against zone, understands like how to help his quarterback out, get into a place where the ball is easier to deliver to, and then also like play the sticks and get first downs. And then after the catch, he's just intelligent using his blockers, using angles, great awareness, fast twitch in terms of getting out of, coming back to a ball and turning upfield. Maybe not the speed and the stop-start ability that we normally see from receivers, but I think his initial burst is good. And I think he just has a really good ability to instinctively go from one action to another. We call it kind of the overlap of like catch to change direction for most receivers is like catch then change direction, and for him it's like he's changing direction as he's catching the ball consistently.
Yeah, I think the way that I would describe it is, I think I described it with train cars for whatever reason in our video itself. But if you wanted to equate it to a safety who perhaps doesn't run the fastest 40 time, but always knows where he needs to be and gets a little bit of a jump on where it is that he needs to go, right? So his play is faster than his actual time speed, and I think that is an offensive representation of what Jackson Smith and Jigba is.
This is like a really weird analogy, but I kind of like it's kind of similar to what you were talking about. But if there's any like biology people, they'll appreciate this. But it's kind of like protein catalysts. Like you need a catalyst that fits the specific protein to make it like be digestible, I guess, or work for a certain reason. And he's just like finding catalysts to his initial actions, like consistently every time, right? Everything just fits together very nicely. Zay Flowers might be he's not the higher floor prospect, but in terms of playing outside, I think he's higher floor. Both these guys, I think, have ability to be game-changing playmakers. We just have worries about size, physical ability, and really how likely it is that they're going to be playing outside consistently. But I think if these guys hit, you're talking about like an Odell Beckham Jr. level talent out of both of these players. It's just it's got to be the right system. It's got to be a team that's invested in that type of player. There are teams that like only want to draft specifically X receivers in the top 15 picks of the draft. They shouldn't be drafting these players that high. I would, but that's how I build my team. So Flowers we've seen Antonio Brown comps, and I honestly, like in the way he moves and plays, I don't think that's stupid. I don't know that it's fair to him to compare him to Antonio Brown, but I think he is the more athletic of these two. I think I'm waiting for the combine because I think he's gonna test well, but he could test really, really well, and that would change my opinion on him as a player. Lower level of competition in the SEC, but he was the best player on the field in every game he played. He ran a full route tree. He was inside and outside. He showed ability at the catch point, stemming routes, and after the catch. And he just plays with the type of swagger and confidence that when he has the ball in his hands, he can tell that he's the type of player who can make something happen at any given point in the game, and just has kind of an extrasensory perception, kind of similar to Smith and Jigba, but with the ball in his hands, but has the added ability to kind of make guys miss in space and burn you around the corner.
Yeah, I think, he's an interesting guy because his stop-start is very impressive. He has that kind of, I don't want to directly equate them, but he kind of reminds me of Garrett Wilson in terms of how violent his cuts are and kind of how he can torque it or twist his body and acrobatically catch things in the air in a way that most guys would just lose their balance when they came down. Somehow he's still on his feet and moving forward. So he's probably a guy who could go to a team and produce yardage more immediately if the if the quarterback room, is a little bit more of a question. I think he's going to be able to, catch balls that he has to come back for a little bit more. He can catch balls that are slightly more inaccurately thrown a little bit more. I think Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to benefit far more from a quarterback who gets him the ball on time and in the correct location, because that's just going to maximize everything that he does. He's not going to necessarily make it happen himself quite as much.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think he's more of a I don't want to call him like a safety valve target, but if he's the second or third option in your play, like he's a really good player to just, if he's open, give it to him. Like it'll be a safe, like complete. Whereas Flowers, is a guy that you more want to chuck the ball up and see what happens. I don't know that Flowers has the best hands in the world. He definitely has the body control. There are some body catches on his tape that I'm a little concerned about, but there are other body catchers in this draft, and he's the one that I'd be most confident in, because the ability for him to kind of catch balls in stride and contort in ways that make it look, easy for him. It's less of a concern for me.
All right. So that takes us to tier 2 or starting wideouts.
Yeah. So these guys there's a projection for them to play on the outside, right? And I don't think you want them playing in one case, you don't want a guy playing slot at all. In the other case, like if the guy's playing slot, he's not become the player that you want him to be. And that's Jordan Addison, who's my wide receiver 3, and Quentin Johnston, who's my wide receiver 4. And Johnston, we discussed in his video, is a guy I really wanted to be higher on. It's tough because he doesn't quite attack the ball the way a 6'4", 215-pound receiver should. But he has incredible burst off the ball. He's really tough runner after the catch. You can see the stop-start ability for his size, that he is a Metcalf-type athlete, maybe not to that level, but in terms of this draft class, like he is that type of athlete at receiver. If you're looking for that X guy who is a better athlete, he's that guy in this draft class. The offense he played in, the way he was used, the lack of a route tree, kind of the lack of, idea of how he's going to stem his routes, make him lower in terms of how much he's got to develop to get to that X spot. He's not going to be a slot guy. Like he needs to make it as an outside receiver. And so the issue with him is if he doesn't fit into this tier 2, he's like in the tier 4 or 5. Like you're kind of like, oh, he's not a slot. We just need to keep working on him until he can play on the outside. Because I think he is physical getting off of the off release. But I don't think he has, the quick feet really to just consistently separate from smaller, quicker corners. But if he hits, he is probably the highest upside receiver in this draft class, just because there isn't that type of athletic profile. And we have seen production in college, and we've seen games from him where he does show more of that aggressive tendency to go for the ball. And that version of Quentin Johnston is the best receiver in this draft class. It's just, for me, it's like Oklahoma State, and then like I haven't seen it in any other games. It doesn't pop up enough. And we've seen that in his production. It's been up and down. He started off last year. He didn't have a lot of yards the year before, and then he started off this year, wasn't doing anything, and then he ends up with like 1,200 receiving yards in his last 2/3 of games, which is crazy. But inconsistencies basically is the name of his game. Jordan Addison is another very safe prospect in my opinion, just because I think if he doesn't work as an outside guy, he's playing slot and he's the tier below this, and that's fine. He is going to be the speedster. A lot of people are talking about Jalen Hyatt, who might run faster than Addison, but I think Addison is way more put together as a deep threat who can stretch the field, because I think he has a much better route tree. He's better after the catch. He's a guy that was actually featured in his offense consistently to a point where like they would ask a lot from him. He does a very good job of setting up these downfield routes with like a much well-rounded, inward, outward route tree. That's not just like go routes and curls. And then also he's shown ability to kind of succeed in two different situations in Pittsburgh and USC. He had a good quarterback play in both cases. But with all these players, you're kind of looking at guys who I would expect go late first round, and they're probably end up having good quarterback play. Like if Addison ends up in like for the Chargers or Cowboys, like he'll have a good setup there. His game is there's less like to really like nitpick. It's kind of, I don't want to call him like a Deshaun. Probably Marquise Brown is like a good comp for him, because I think he's like that level of outside receiver where if you have that guy, you're like, we could probably upgrade and add another guy, but we don't feel bad about him as our wide receiver one. I think an underrated part of his game is how good he is after the catch. The issue is his thing is he can't break tackles. He has to be in space. He has to be shifty. He has to have time to make guys miss in space because his frame is he is the smallest, like skinniest frame in this draft class. Zay Flowers is shorter, but I think Addison is going to weigh similarly at a greater height, which is, and then also there's a big question about him last year. He just was awful in contested catch situations. Like you want him separating downfield and getting into space to catch the ball. That being said, I think he's the deep threat in this class that you feel best about, and that will get him drafted highly.
So would you say that there's probably a reasonable comparison between he and Chris Olave, with Chris Olave probably being a little bigger?
Olave was a little bit bigger, not a whole lot actually, but I would say Olave just had a few things like his body control, catching the ball downfield. I think he was more complete underneath as a receiver. He was better at catching the ball in stride. He was better at, timing his routes up. I think Addison is just his name. His whole game right now is trying to set up the deep route. Whereas I think Olave is you could ask him to do a little more, which is why he's going to go, why he went higher.
You had to guess what do you think he's going to measure in at? What have you heard?
Addison, 6 footer, 6'1", and I think probably 170, a little under 175 probably.
Yeah, that is pretty slight. But yeah, I mean, I think he could play outside. I do suspect it. I think, a little time to get stronger will probably help. I mean, we saw Devontae Smith do it, and he's probably similar frame. He might have been even more slender.
I think more slender. He weighed in at one point in the 160s, and I think like they probably put some water weight on him at the NFL Combine to make sure that got up. But he's very skinny. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think his cuts are harder. I feel like Devontae Smith's are. Addison is very, very fluid. So there's a difference between the two, but I think maybe you'd compare Chris Olave to Smith perhaps even more. But all right. Who do we have next here? The tier 3 wide receivers, slot receivers mostly.
Yeah, so the idea of this tier is you kind of want to put slot receivers in here. You can make some there's some like leeway with that, in that when we did this at SIS, if a guy is a good enough X player that he's probably going to be your wide receiver 3 and you'll find their slot, and then, maybe he can have some slot versatility, like you would put him in this tier, but we try not to put a lot of non-slot receivers in this tier. It's just kind of made up for guys who don't deserve the wide receiver 4 label, but also shouldn't be starting wide receivers right off the bat. But this guy at the top of the tier was too good. The rest are slots. So for me, wide receiver 5 for me is Xavier Hutchinson from Iowa State, who is another guy where I need to see him test. I don't know how athletic he is watching him against Big 12 defenders, because he looks explosive as hell. He's fast. He can cut. He's 6'3", 205. He's a big dude and he can move. But there's inconsistencies in his game. Like sometimes he gets off press very well with the physicality and quick feet. Other times he struggles with it. He is a guy who plays a lot of slot, and they motion him kind of to get good matchups with him. He's a good contested catch player, but mostly because his hands are good. If you hit the guy at the catch point, he doesn't always bring in the ball, and that's a little concerning to me, although his body control is great. There's all these downfield plays where it's an awkward throw and he contorts himself to get his hands on it and he just doesn't bring it in. But it's like, oh my God, it looks so athletic. He just needs to finish the catch. After the catch, like a big guy that runs hard and is tough. He has all these things going for him. It's just, again, this is an offense at Iowa State that is not really featuring receiver play. There are people bringing up the he's a Hakeem Butler thing. I think he's a better separator than Hakeem Butler. I don't think we're going to have that issue. The question for him is just, he might be a slot guy because of how he plays and how he was used. but he's kind of big, and I'm not certain you really want that. He might start out there, and you might move him to the outside, but I'm not certain he's good enough really right off the bat to be an outside receiver. But he's also was extremely productive at Iowa State. And so for me, like he's a guy whose grade, for me personally, like could be affected by the combine. Like if he tests really well, I could go back, watch the tape, and be like, oh, maybe he is a starting right off the bat. And if he doesn't, I might be thinking more of wide receiver 4 territory, where it's like, okay, well, we saw this at college, but it's clear that Big 12 defenses were bad, and that was a part of it. So that's kind of what's going on with him a little bit. Although I have some, like Donnie Clemens pick and spread has him wide receiver 2, I believe, is a huge fan of him. He has games where he disappears. That's the thing that's a little concerning. And I think, and I would have to like really dive in a little bit more just to see what defenses are doing to him that's creating that. But I think, physical corners have given him a little bit more trouble. He's 6'3", but he's only 205. That's a little bit of a slight frame for a guy that's that tall. It could be a pad level thing, and then you're working on that. So he needs some development for sure. But I think he's good enough that he's a part of an offense year 2 in terms of starting lineup. And then the rest of these guys are all slot. I mean, they are starting slot receivers year 2, in my opinion. Jalen Hyatt, Josh Downs, Tank Dell. Hyatt probably has the best chance to play outside, but only because he is a deep threat, and that's like what he does. And you might want to move him outside just to stretch the field on the exterior of the field. But for me, he is the least complete player on this list. I think he's just quite frankly. Well, we already talked about Hendon Hooker in the quarterbacks video. Like that offense is just. It's not football. Like it is football, but like, you know what I mean? Like teams run cover 4 against them because they're terrified that they're going to just burn them downfield. And then they need like the linebackers to expand from the middle outwards to defend the run because Hooker can run read option still. And then what they'll do, Tennessee, is they'll just run a vertical with the one receiver who runs a 4-3. And then Hyatt, who runs a 4-2, will run like a fade vertical behind that. And it's just a cover 4 beater. And Hyatt has all these touchdowns where it's like, there is no one 20 yards around him, and he's just wide open. And it certainly padded his production to a degree where it's like, I think there are people who are really high on Hyatt, and I personally don't. Like he's going to get drafted highly because of the speed, and he has a frame that's like pretty good for his speed. He's tall, and like he can catch the ball downfield better than most burners do. And he's a really tough player. Like you watch him, and he's a guy that like shoves dudes after the play. Like he just wants to get after. He's a really good blocker, which is why ultimately I think he ends up in the slot because he can use his blocking versatility where he's either a crackdown player or a deep threat. But the limited route tree and release package and understanding of how to run routes, year 1 to me is a guy that doesn't play a whole lot. You kind of have a couple of shot plays that you have in your playbook for him, and he doesn't do a whole lot else. And then year 2, you really try to expand his role. Downs is really like the slot guy where he won't be anything but a slot and probably will just be like if you need a slot receiver, Josh Downs is not going to bust, and he's not going to be anything more than that, right? Twitchy, fast, the guy that uses a gadget player. They line up in the backfield, sometimes handing the ball off. They love to use him on jet motion plays, really good in space, kind of like Jordan Addison, but not a guy that's going to break tackles. He does have the ability out of the slot against less athletic safeties to completely burn them on deep routes, but I don't know that he has necessarily the speed to like do that consistently game to game. He's like, if you want to add, okay, so like Elijah Moore would be a good comparison for that, except for I think even Moore is probably a better player. Like Moore was viewed by the
Jamison Crowder.
Yeah, but Crowder was a bad athlete is the thing. Crowder ran like a 4.72. He just was really like savvy. Downs, that you think about Crowder as like what he'll be at the next level. It's just that I think Crowder was more developed and had played in college for a long time, and Downs is more just he is that athletic that he can just make slot corners miss when they're trying to press him at the line of scrimmage ever, because he is smaller, and that's the way to get him. And the same thing with Tank Dell, who's the next guy on this list, is small. And if you can press him, like he's not getting off the line of scrimmage. He weighs like 163 at the Senior Bowl, but he's a guy that, has the twitchiness to get open and separate, not as refined of a route runner, needs to learn that more. But the thing is, he is the most dynamic player with the ball in his hands in this draft class at receiver, right? We saw this at the Senior Bowl. We saw this at Houston. Like he is just unbelievable getting to the edge, getting to space, and then using that ability once he gets to space, like making guys miss, and a dynamic player that will have a role in an offense, even if it's not as a starting slot, because he's a guy that you just have to hand the ball and see what he does, right? He's probably more versatile than these other guys just because he might be a punt returner, maybe. I don't know if his body holds up against that. We'll see how much weight he adds at the NFL level, because that's going to be an important thing for him. But he might also test very well, and I'm interested to see how that goes for him.
So you know who my comp is for Xavier Hutchinson, and I feel pretty strongly about this. What everybody said about Drake London last year that were wrong, which I disagreed with then, that's exactly what Xavier Hutchinson actually is. Big guy, has great ability to track the ball in the air. He can catch 50-50 balls at a higher than 50-50 rate, but he doesn't really separate exceptionally well. He's open when he's not open because of those traits, but London actually can separate even at his size.
Mhm.
I don't think Xavier Hutchinson really
Yeah.
has a great ability to do that.
I think
so.
Hutchinson's thing is, if you dial him up on a sluggo or a double move, like, he's going to burn the corner if it's like a well-timed play call, because he's athletic enough to do it, but the nuance to his routes is not there. And I think, like, the stop-start, he has the stop. I don't know if he has the start.
Yeah, he doesn't. He's got some reasonable top speed. That's why sometimes he looks explosive, or explosive as hell, as you put it. But that's kind of when he's got full steam.
Mm-hmm.
He probably has like a good, flying 20, or solid at least for his size.
It's a tier down from the guys at the top of this, for sure.
For sure. Yeah. So I definitely couldn't be putting him up at number 2 personally, but there's a place for him. And I think in the right place, in the right system, with a team that, deploys him correctly, he's definitely a 1,000-yard receiver.
He's what the next guy we're going to talk about, I think, would have looked like in college if he had played more.
All right, next
Except
tier.
for the next tier, yeah. Okay. You introduce it, right? Sorry.
No, hey, man, you can do your thing, too. Tier 4, developmental receivers.
Yeah, so this is just one guy, and I'm not going to have a whole lot of developmental players. This is a tier at SIS that they don't ever use. It's supposed to be for guys that like came over from Cameroon and haven't played the sport and are like trying to learn and like I would have put Jelani Woods in this tier last year as a tight end, because he just did not know what he was doing as a route runner, but he was a freak athlete. They would have still given him like a normal tight end grade. I like to put more guys in this tier. Personally, I'm kind of doing my own thing here. And Keishawn Butte for me is in this tier because he's a freak, and to the degree that he's probably more athletic than Hutchinson and has done it more at the SEC level. So that, there were times where I personally, we did Max Chadwick, our friend at PFF, just wrote an article where he did like everyone is eligible mock draft. Well, that was initially a video last year for Boomer Bust that he turned into an article for PFF. And I took Keishawn Butte 11th overall for Washington. So, and I also said in that video, like, there's a good chance that this guy is not even like a top 100 pick. I still think he will be, because I think the pedigree is there. He was a very high recruit. He had a couple of games early in his career at LSU against good defense where he just had like 300 yards. Like, he did the Jackson Smith and Jigba in this Rose Bowl game twice, but it's lesser known. The issue is, outside of those 2 games, he had like 800 yards the whole year because he just didn't play. He had a bunch of injuries. Last year, he was also injured. This year, he starts out poorly. There were some like off-field things. Didn't really get into it. He started producing more as the year went on. He kind of meshed with Jaden Daniels a little bit more. But he's a guy he's 6'205". I'm a little surprised he's like that small, because I think he looks jacked up. Like, his upper body is very big. His legs might need to fill out a little bit more, and then he could probably get up to 210, 215. But for that size, like, he has good burst. His stop start is decent. I don't know if it's amazing, but he's also just extremely powerful and physical. He's not a guy you really can get your hands on and slow down. So there are, plays on tape where he, presses, the vertical, comes back to catch a curl, runs through 2 tacklers and is gone, because he's just that much of a kind of a bulldog type mentality. There's a potential for this type of player to be AJ Brown, right? I don't think that's going to happen based on the way his career has gone so far, and kind of like we were hoping that development curve would happen earlier. But he certainly has X receiver starting ability if things go right. You need to give him time. He's probably not playing as much at all year one, but year two, like, you probably work him into the slot a little bit. You're getting him on the outside. You're hoping he can expand his release package to more than just physicality moves, which he has down, but he needs to kind of get the footwork right on more of these, quickness releases, because he can be shifty, right? It's just at full speed. He's not a guy that is going to run these more intricate routes really well out of the slot. So it's not where you want him ending up long term. But there is a high ceiling for this player that he is not really close to yet.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the reasons that you get the feeling that he's bigger than he is I think he has a pretty long wingspan.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you watch him on tape, I think his arms are probably disproportionately long to his body, and they're not slender either. Because you see, like, he'll catch a ball like pretty far away from his body, and like there's a distance between he and the ball that he can cover without actually leaping or diving for it, that a normal 6'1" receiver would not be able to. Just from watching the tape, I suspect he'll measure in with kind of unusually long arms, possibly big hands as well. I get the feeling he's got big hands from the way that he plays. And yeah, he plays like a tree trunk out there too. Like his core strength is probably very high or very, very strong. Contact balance is high for a wide receiver. He's a unique player, you can tell, without watching that much of him.
Yeah, and that was the case last year when we did our intro videos, which were our last videos at Boomer Bust, on prospects that were names going into next year. And Butte was a guy we had obviously our eyes on. I jokingly said, like, this guy could end up being a UDFA. Like, he's not going to be a UDFA, but he some people had him as like a top 5 player, and I was just like, he very well could not be even close to that just because of the way things have gone so far. But the reason that people had him that high is because the flashes of just what you're talking about, like the contact, like the inability to stop him once he gets going is different compared to anyone else in this class. Even like a Quentin Johnston is he's a little bit like skinny, right? Because of his build. Like he's a guy you can get under his pad level. It doesn't happen with Butte. He just runs through you. Where was I going with this? But the way I put it was, he's an athlete that hasn't figured out exactly how to use it to be a good receiver. So the way I would compare his tape is like when you watch high school players in general, you're not really like trying to figure out what type of player they are. You're just looking for how athletic they are. It really, like, it's all just pedigree in terms of traits in high school, because high school football is crapshoot and they don't know what they're doing. Like, it's just bad. Go watch a high school football game and tell me if you learned anything. You won't. It's bad.
Don't tell Texas that.
Don't tell. Texas is probably a little different. Honestly, to get them even more mad, Florida's the high school football state. But all right, they do take. It's a big deal down in those states. So it's probably a little bit higher level there. But in Syracuse, we didn't watch those players as much as you could imagine. Butte looks like a high school player who you would recruit really highly still. Like, he has the kind of play style where he's like, I'm just going to outrun you, or I'm just going to outmuscle you. And there's nothing much else going on there. So there's a bit of a commitment that needs to be made to his development for sure. And deciding like what player he is. Maybe he is a slot receiver. I don't know. He certainly, there have been 6'2", 205 receivers who play bully ball out of the slot and make a career out of it. AJ Brown initially, he's much bigger, was kind of a slot guy at Tennessee. So it wouldn't be unheard of. But I don't know. Whoever drafts him has to have a specific plan for this player. And I can't sit up here and tell you that there's one that I could think of that is best for him at this point.
Yeah. I think he just needs to get with a really good wide receiver coach, and he's just got to have just one of those guys that is going to need to make a major time investment. Probably going to have to work outside of practice and just, refine himself, because otherwise he'll always be a guy who will have like 400 yards a season and a few highlight catches, and he has a lot more potential than that. All right. Tier 5 wide receiver 4s / or with special teams ability.
Yeah, so the reason that's notated is because 4s and 5s so the next tier is 5s with special teams ability, and then the 2 tiers after that are 4s without and 5s without. So like like a player I really like this film was CJ Johnson. I saw an article about him from East Carolina. I talked about this with you at the Senior Bowl, so you're just hearing the story second time. My bad, but you're not the audience, so I don't care.
That's podcast.
He's going to be in that wide receiver 4s without special teams ability because he never played special teams in college, and he's probably not going to get drafted because of that. I don't know what kind of athlete he is. If he goes and runs a 4.3, I don't think he's going to run a 4.3. You probably move him up a tier into the special teams ability because that translates. But I don't expect that. I think he's more of a low 4.5s guy who has good change of direction, might have a good 3-cone. He's pretty big. But he will be a priority undrafted free agent because of that. You have to use your selections on guys that are going to make your roster, and special teams is the only way to guarantee that with these type of players. So these players have special teams ability, and the top guy for this tier and my 10th wide receiver is Parker Washington from Penn State, who I really wanted to be super high on and put in my slot tier. Watching Penn State live this year, I thought he was awesome. I was like, this guy, I'm going to be so high on. I might have like an early second round grade on. Like, he's going to be great. And then like diving into his tape, you kind of saw why he really only had 650 receiving yards this year, kind of what Penn State asked him to do and how he was used. He's a gadgety slot guy. He's 5'10", 215, like built like a running back. They used him as a blocker. They would sometimes bring him in and have him be like a lead blocker. They motioned him a lot, but his route tree was very much like quick in-out breaking routes, slants, outs, curls. Very rarely did he go deep. And if he did, like, he really wasn't getting much separation because he doesn't really have the top end speed, but his stop-start ability and his power after the catch to kind of break tackles is impressive. Impressive enough that he is their punt returner and a pretty good punt returner, which is why he's in the special teams tier, because this is a guy you bring in and you put him back there to return punts right off the bat. Like, that's what he's going to do for you. And he's your wide receiver 4. Hopefully that works out. He has a ceiling where he ends up being a really good slot player. But Washington to me is like what I think teams viewed Khalil Shakir as last year. I had Shakir higher. I thought he's a better athlete. Like, that guy ran in the lower 4.4s. I think Washington probably runs the 4.5s. And because of that, like, I had Shakir as probably in the slot tier, but I was higher on him. Washington is in this tier because of the kind of inability to stretch the field. I don't think he's like a tremendous guy at the catch point, although he has really good hands. He does. I'd be wrong about that. He has. I think all the Penn State receivers have really good hands, probably because of Sean Clifford, like, so consistently like putting it outside of their catch radius and having to just make these crazy catches. But a lot of those catches were kind of when he's wide open, right? I haven't seen him do this jump ball thing where he's, being contested, what Jahan Dotson, has done to that degree, where Dotson was their wide receiver 1 and they were just kind of throwing the ball constantly, even when he was covered. Washington really only got the ball when he was wide open because of his role in that Penn State offense.
He did have one. I mean, he only had a couple of touchdowns this year, and one of them he did go up and get it. So, seeing it once doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to become a consistent part of his game. But
he has a great catch radius. Like, he does. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think I gave his hands like a 6, which is a really good grade for hands. But I don't think he's a player like with Dotson. Taylor Heineke would just chuck him the ball up and it works, like same with McLaurin. Like, they're just players that they don't have to have separation to make catches. Mm-hmm. I think Washington, his high end is that, but I don't think he's that type of player. I think he needs to be a guy that gets open consistently to make it higher than this initial grade for me.
Yeah, I also think that once he leaves his feet, you don't see him coming down with balance very often either. He has a tendency to, once he leaves his feet, he just gives himself up. And if he catches in stride, he can keep moving, but he just doesn't have that natural like aerial balance that some other top guys have. Mm-hmm. But I can see why you do like him though.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it's the production is going to hurt him a lot because it's just they the Penn State offense was not great this year for a Penn State offense. It was fine. Like they won the Rose Bowl. This was like in terms of last decade, like this was a pretty good year for Penn State. The fans are very happy with what happened. I don't know that Max is, but you could have a whole talk about that and their inability to make the playoff. You would have expected from him in this season where they were good, they won 11 games, that it would be a little bit more in terms of the numbers. And I think one thing we really emphasize at SIS when they were kind of teaching us how to go through these grades is like how much does the team trust them, like in terms of usage? So like a concern that I believe I brought up in the Will Levis video, but I don't know, is like, how do quarterbacks get used in the red zone and on third downs? Do they trust them? And unlike the other 3 top QBs in this class, Will Levis, Kentucky would consistently run the ball on third down and consistently run the ball in the red zone, even with a really bad O-line. Now, maybe they're just stupid, but can't really assume that. Like, you kind of have to be like, why aren't they trusting him? Parker Washington's a guy that I think was their best receiver in terms of the role he was given, but they never expanded upon that role. And I have to think that, there are some pretty good offensive coordinators. And Bill O'Brien was over there, right? So like, that's like an NFL offensive coordinator. You have to think there's some reason why they wouldn't expand his role a little bit more.
Bill O'Brien was at Alabama this past year.
Right.
But he was the Penn State head coach.
He was there before.
Yeah.
But they have some ex-college head coach who's their offensive coordinator. I forget who it is.
I have to double check. If the coach is in the NFL, I know where they coached in college. That's how I like. If they went back to college, I honestly have no idea. So but you know me, my look. I still haven't watched a deep dive on most of these college players yet. I'm slowly accruing them as we go, but that's just the way that it is for me, being more NFL focused. But look, I think it's a solid class of wide receivers. I think you're going to find guys who can make an impact for you day one. I think that there are guys who, can develop. I think if you need a specific role, I don't think there's a single type of player that if you need that, it's not available. I don't know if there's this massive wealth of them. So if you do have a specific type of player you need, you might have to, go up and get him. I'm not sure that you can just be like, okay, well, I guess I can just get that guy later and he can be pretty much just as good. Maybe there's some speed guys that you might be able to do that with. But in terms of bigger guys who go up and catch the ball, not a huge a plethora of them. In terms of, super refined route runners, not a plethora of them. But it's a solid class. I think it's a solid class. And sometimes we get spoiled by the fact that we've had a couple of really, really good ones over the past few years. But I don't think that we should, make light of what's available here in this draft.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see like 4, maybe 5 of these guys go in the first round just because, people have this, like, I think the old-fashioned football mentality is like quarterback is the most important position. And then it's like edge and tackle. The analytics people would say it's wide receiver and corner. Now you get a whole discussion. For me personally, I just group all those together and say tier 2 is edge, tackle, wide receiver, corner, and maybe even interior defensive line now, because we're seeing the impact pass rushing at that position can have for your team. Teams value receiver. It's a very important position. Slot, lesser so, but like having outside options, look at the Bears. Like, they had good offensive line play, really. Like, that was a good offensive line. People don't talk about it. Like, in terms of what they were expecting, maybe not like it's not top 10, but like people were like, oh, this is going to be one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL. Braxton Jones graded out as the highest rookie PFF tackle. They developed some of their interior players. They added Tevin Jenkins to the inside there. Cody Whitehair played like a full season for the first time in a while. Maybe not completely full, but like 12 games. And Larry Bourne was like decent as well. And they were able to run the ball. And it didn't really matter because their receivers were Chase Claypool, who can't separate, and Darnell Mooney, who's good, but he's a slot guy. Like, it's a position group that I think people like to, people who have been in this game for like a long time like to kind of underrate in terms of its value, because you don't really want to build a team that is just the Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, like chuck it up and see what happens. It doesn't really always work. But the Bengals have shown can to a degree, right? It doesn't necessarily win you a Super Bowl, but the other thing that's important about it, and I think this is with corners, like you have 3 of them on the field in the majority of your plays, right? Like you need a lot of depth at receiver. And that's why I think you see teams basically draft receivers every draft. This is the position that gets the most selections. There will be 35 receivers selected.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just because, for one, there are, at this point, more teams who run 11 personnel as their primary offensive package than any other offensive package in the league.
Mm-hmm.
So you have more of them on the field at any given time than any other skill group. I mean, depending on if you lump offensive line together, but also they get tired, you sub them out, which you generally don't do for offensive line. Plus they get hurt more regularly because they're flying all over the field, taking hits. You know what I mean? They're not in condensed spaces hand fighting. They're, getting decapitated by safeties, or
they're the smallest players on the field. Like they get hurt.
They're also small, and they play special teams. So they can be gunners, they can be returners. So, I mean, they're probably just one of the most influential types of players in football, period, outside of, the quarterback, which the whole game is designed around. So, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. There, like you said, there'll be a lot. There's so many guys that I haven't had the chance to look at that I can't bring up yet. At this point, my clear favorite is Jackson Smith and Jigba, but that is and it's distinctly my favorite, but I haven't watched nearly enough to be like, okay, this is one of my guys. This is one of my guys. I need more time for that. But Jackson Smith and Jigba, I will slap my name on. And, I mean, I can slap my name on Jalen Carter, but that's not exactly going out on a limb, right? I think Jackson Smith and Jigba is a guy who, as highly as he was touted last year, he's not generally mocked in the top 10. And to me, that's just kind of crazy. I feel like that we talk about it in the individual breakdown, but that's just overthinking to me.
Especially when I think you see Johnston and Addison go that high. And I think there's 2 things going on. First of all, Jigba just didn't play, so prospect fatigue, like we're forgetting how good he was. And I think there are a lot of people, the athleticism thing is real. Like I think people were like, oh, he's not a good athlete, and just kind of brushed it aside. But I also think Johnston and Addison getting mocked that high kind of has a lot to do with the fact that their teams were good last year, because I don't look at those guys and go like, these players are clearly like better than, say, Flowers right now. And I think that's literally just a Boston College thing. And I think Jalen Hyatt, to a degree as well, like is higher up because of how good Tennessee's offense was. There's definitely production matters at the receiver position. Like I just talked about how Parker Washington is hurt by the fact he didn't produce. But I think there's an important comparison there with a guy like Hyatt who had a historic season in terms of production. And to me, it's like it doesn't matter that much just because of the way it happened, and the context. And in both cases, we discussed the context, but Smith and Jigba also had an insane season 2 years ago. It was a leading receiver with Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson on the roster. And that context seems to be dropped off in discussions.
Yeah, it makes me laugh. Someone's gonna walk away with him and be very, very happy, and everyone is gonna forget quickly about who underrated him, and because that's just the game that we live in. But I mean, I would make him a priority if you need a pass catcher. I think when you see what else is available at wide receiver, if you want one to contribute year one, he's the guy, I think. I like Zay Flowers too, but I haven't done a deep dive on him. Haven't really watched too much. I've really just seen some highlight cut-ups, and when you see that, there's definitely a lot there, but I want to see more down-to-down stuff because there's a lot of stuff that you just don't get. Quentin Johnston, I don't know. I think he's distinctly number 4 behind those other guys for me.
I toy with him and Addison at 3 and 4. The thing is, I started out with Johnston kind of high, so I still kind of am holding on to a little bit. But I just think Addison's ceiling is capped to where he is. He's gonna be if he becomes an outside receiver for you, you're always gonna be but what if we had a better outside receiver? That's my thing.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think, again, he's very fluid in his motions, and he is a bit more linear, but the way that he catches the ball, there's no wasted motion there. It I think there's just some better understanding of the receiver position, which I think
His USC tape looks different than his Pittsburgh tape. That's something that I
right.
didn't
Well, I
really
mean, look,
bring
he's
up.
coming off a Biletnikoff season last year
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So they're in 2021. So it is different. I think they used him a little bit differently. You know, and he went from Kenny Pickett to Caleb Williams. So as far as quarterbacks go, you kind of got the best you possibly could as a wideout over the past couple of years. I feel like he knows who he is as a player more than Quentin Johnston does.
Yeah.
And I love to see that in college players, because that means they don't have to learn it when they get to the NFL. They just get better at it, ideally. When I see a guy who, and like, that's even something I like about Xavier Hutchinson is that I'm not saying he's better than Quentin Johnston, but I think he knows who he is. I'm not sure Quentin Johnston truly does yet. So I think his coaching is going to be really, really important for him. Not that it's not important for everybody, but you know what I mean. All right. So that's going to do it for us today. You can find, at this point, Bryce Young, Jalen Carter, CJ Stroud, Will Levis, and Anthony Richardson up on the YouTube channel for our prospect breakdowns. And then in a matter of about a day, you will also be able to find our Quentin Johnston and Jackson Smith and Jigba breakdowns. And then shortly after that, you should be able to find Jordan Addison and Jalen Hyatt breakdowns. And then we will circle back to some other positions as we go forward. So if you like what you see, throw a like our way. You can comment on any of the videos about who you would most like to see breakdowns for. And then, of course, we are live every Monday and Thursday to break down our rankings for the prospects, as well as do some previews for the offseason for each division. We had to flex a couple of things around this week, but we should be back to our normal schedule next week. If you are into offensive line player, you want to learn more about it, you check out the Brick Wall Breakdowns with Kyron Samuels and I, and you can also find me on Twitter at TheMaxD, Nick at Nick with Sports. Shout out to our producer, Noah Ashley at Noah Ashley Sports, not with us today, but still helps set everything up. And at Defiant Takes on all social media outlets for Defiant Takes Football. All right, Nick, have a good one, and I will talk to you probably very soon to do more prospect breakdowns.
Probably, yes.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.